I don't have a PowerPoint, but I have put the fly sheet on the screen so you can follow the lecture. I'll go very quickly over the first section, Aristotle's life and influence. Aristotle is perhaps one of the most influential thinkers of all times, deservedly so. And I'll try to focus on what is it about Aristotle's ethics, especially, which is the subject of this lecture, that makes him deserving of this reputation. And I'll not only try to explain the main features of his moral philosophy, but to try to give you a sense of why it is still of contemporary relevance. Of the many fields in which he dealt, and you have in the first section a list of the areas, with the exception of physics and biology, and he was a great biologist, with the exception of these two natural sciences that are now part of the history of science. You don't study Aristotle when you study biology, nor do you study Aristotle when you study physics. But most likely, especially in the case of biology, he is part of the history of science. Darwin in the 19th century made a statement that the greatest biologist of all times, maybe including himself, I don't know, is Aristotle. Doesn't mean that Aristotle's biology is the state of the art. It is not. One of the sharp contrasts between science, especially natural sciences, and disciplines like philosophy is that there is a different sense of what progress means in these disciplines. In the case of biology and physics and the other sciences, progress has been very, very impressive. If we go back especially to the level at which these sciences reached in the 4th century BC when Aristotle was living and writing. Not so in the case of philosophy. I will not try to go into the question of how to explain this, but perhaps the sense of the lecture and your reading of Aristotle and thinking about his ethics might give you a sense of why this is so. If you go into medicine, as some of you are trying, and I wish you good luck, you will find that Aristotelian ethics, now called virtue ethics, is the central moral theory that is taken very, very seriously by those interested in medical ethics and bioethics. And I'll try to, again, give you a sense of why this is so. Main things to remind you of Aristotle: you probably have encountered Aristotle in your baccalaureate program or your secondary education. You can date him by the fact that he was the tutor, the teacher of Alexander the Great. He was a good friend of Philip, King Philip, the father of Alexander. He is the culmination of classical Greek culture, not only in philosophy, but in most of the areas in which Hellenic period, the classical period of Greek philosophy and science and art, culminated. Now, in order to understand his ethics, it might help to remind ourselves of some features of Aristotle's general philosophy. We are at Roman numeral 2 now. Because Aristotle had a system. What does that mean? Not only did he deal with numerous areas of inquiry, but the conclusions he arrived at, the views he advocated, form a coherent set of ideas. There is a worldview, there's a perspective that could be described as uniquely Aristotelian. There's a way of looking at the world if you look at it from the perspective of Aristotle. So he formed what historians of ideas call a system. And it is indeed coherent, at least in this sense, to make a specific reference to the topic of this lecture, Aristotle's ethics, it would help enormously the student and scholar trying to understand Aristotle's ethics, to understand his metaphysics and other features of his general philosophy. And the Roman numeral 2 in the lecture focuses on three doctrines that Aristotle explained and advocated that would help us understand his ethics. In the distant past, I see Mr. Shbaya here, we used to give 2 lectures on Aristotle. The first lecture is on metaphysics and so on, and so the person lecturing on his ethics can count on the fact, assume, that the students have already become familiar with those features. So I will try to make up for this fact that you have not had the benefit of a lecture on Aristotle's metaphysics and his overall theory, and refer to 3 specific features of Aristotle's metaphysics, if you want to call them so, that are important in themselves and are very useful in understanding his ethics. These are, first I begin with the teleological view of the world. The term teleological comes from the Greek term telos, meaning aim, objective, purpose. So the Aristotelian worldview is filled with purposefulness. Things are for a reason. There is a final cause for everything. The famous 4 causes of Aristotle, which you may have studied in your baccalaureate program, the famous 4 causes include not only the material cause, to understand about anything, what sort of thing it is. He gives the example, let's say, of a statue. The material cause is the marble, out of which it was carved. There must be also what Aristotle calls an efficient cause. You need the sculptor and the chisel and so on to act upon the shapeless marble to produce a statue of a person, of a knight on horseback, or whatever. And there is also not only the material cause and the efficient cause, the sculpture, the formal cause. You have to have an idea about what is it that you want to produce by performing your activities on this piece of marble. And finally, and this is very important for Aristotle, what is the purpose of producing this sculpture? The final cause, the end, the purpose. Not only is this true of artifacts, things we produce and make and so on, but it is true of everything, Aristotle claimed. So it becomes an important task to search for these causes, not only the material cause and the efficient cause and the formal cause, but also the final cause, as he called it. This is a teleological way of looking at the world. This lent itself very nicely to theologians who were monotheists, who believe in one God, in both the Christian and Muslim traditions, because this view of the world as purposeful, as design, as going somewhere, lends itself very nicely to their religious perspective. Okay, his doctrine of potentiality and actuality is very interesting in itself, but is of special relevance and significance for understanding his ethics and his politics to some degree. So the distinction is very simple, and I'll use an example that Aristotle himself gives to illustrate his point. The example of the acorn, baluta, they're all on campus. The acorn is actually, it possesses a property that it now has. It has a mass, it has some nutritional value, it is bitter, and so on. This is what the acorn actually is at a given point. But that's not the whole story. The acorn has the potential of becoming an oak tree. Of course, not every acorn becomes an oak tree. And so we have this very, very important point that Aristotle emphasizes. what is needed in order for the acorn to realize its potential. It needs soil, moisture, and then sunlight. It needs protection from the goats and من الحطاب بعدين قصة سنة. So the process of realizing your potential requires a sustaining environment, if you wish. And you can apply this to education, to ethics, and to politics. And I'll try to point out how useful this becomes when Aristotle develops his idea of virtues. What are virtues and how to make sure that the child will grow to possess these character traits. So it's essentially working on a potential which is there. The child, human beings, have the potential of becoming social, decent individuals and citizens. This is not an outcome which is guaranteed in some automatic, natural way. We have to work very hard on that. And Aristotle's contribution both to politics and ethics provide us a map, if you want, a guidelines as to how to ensure that this process produces the desired end. The good person and the good citizen. إنسان فاضل مواطن صالح. Politics and ethics. And that is, these should be the primary purposes of any human community, to make sure that the way we raise our children will contribute to this very important fact, to make sure that both the ethical and political components are fully understood, the child's potential to possess the appropriate virtues are acknowledged, nourished, and brought to fruition. The potential becomes actual. Let's now move directly to his moral theory. Now we're in Roman 3 on the fly sheet. Eudaimonia. This is a term often used by commentators on Aristotle to avoid focusing on pleasure or even happiness. Because for Aristotle, in the Greek language, eudaimonia means flourishing, well-being, izdihar, realizing your potential, if you wish to use his own terms. So the idea of happiness, which is also often used to express this same idea, that all action, all purposeful actions, or actions that we choose to do as agents have a purpose, and the purpose, the end of all action, is the attainment of good, the good being happiness. Sometimes the term pleasure is used. Now, maybe it's useful to jump a little and make an important point in order not to misunderstand Aristotle. Aristotle emphasized the fact that all action seek to attain this good, happiness, or pleasure, if you wish. What distinguishes him from hedonists who focus on pleasure as an end in itself is that he felt that the best way to attain pleasure and live happily is to be virtuous. So his advice, don't focus too much on attaining pleasure. Focus instead on being virtuous. Of course, it is important for the community as a whole to be aware of this fact, because by the time the child is an adult, he is well formed. So if we make sure that our children grow up to possess proper character traits, these predispositions to act in certain ways, and we make sure that these predispositions are good, that we have a predisposition to act in the right way, in the good way. These are the virtues. This is his definition of virtue. Virtue first is a character trait. It is therefore a predisposition to act in a certain way. And if it produces good actions, it is a virtue. If we have a predisposition to do bad things, it is a vice. So the potential is there. And this is again why it is important to make sure that the process of ensuring that the potential of the child to become a virtuous adult is addressed, nourished, sustained, and this, of course, depends on the environment in which children in any given human community grow. With this goes emphasis on habit. How do we make sure that the child will have these predispositions? By the proper example, by habituation, the same way we acquire other skills and other predispositions and abilities to act in certain ways. You don't become a concert pianist unless you practice for hours and hours playing the piano. You don't become an Olympic swimmer unless you practice for many, many hours and days. So by the time you have acquired these skills, this becomes a second nature by training, by habit. So the Olympic swimmer will glide over the surface of the water with coordinated motions of arm and leg. It looks almost automatic. To get there, we need training, we need habituation. I have at the last page a number of quotations. Let me read one of them. It is we have on the right page here. Yeah, this is the last page. He says ethics is not an exact science, any more than are medicine and the art of navigation. These are his two famous examples, navigation and medicine, because they were thoroughly developed by his time. And consequently, the rules of conduct that it lays down are the rules of conduct that ethics lays down are only of general validity, and their application must vary with the circumstances of the particular occasion. So in this sense, he was a situationist, a contextualist. And when we get to the doctrine of the mean, I'll come back to this point. So there are these, what he says about determining exactly where the mean lies, I'll discuss that in a minute, and also his overall view of ethics as not an exact science, but as something which is situational. We have to rely heavily on perception, on how we assess a situation. He uses the expression frequently in his writing, we leave that to perception. We cannot say now how we should act until we confront a specific situation. So again, in this sense, he was a contextualist. He was not a relativist, but he believed that deciding what the right thing to do can be done best within the context where we are called upon to make these decisions. The pre-preparation, if you want, to ensure that the right decisions are made have to begin with infancy almost. The working on the potential of the child as a social being to acquire the right character traits. So it's a long process that must begin from childhood, from early in the life. There are other quotations from the playing the lyre. This is a musical instrument that the Greeks had. That you training, if you're trained to play this instrument in a certain way, if proper training, you become a good player. If you acquire bad habits, you become a bad player. So habits do not guarantee that the outcome would be what we desire it to be. It depends what sort of habituation is involved. You're trained to do the right thing. A trainer would often say, I wish you didn't have this course, or I wish you have not had this training. I have now to unlearn, as it were, to make you forget the wrong training you had in order to have the proper training. Okay. So let's look more closely at Aristotle's virtue ethics. I have defined virtue in this general sense as a predisposition to act in the right way. How do we decide what actions are virtuous and what actions are not? We have here the famous doctrine of the mean, the famous Aristotelian doctrine of the mean. I give the example of courage. Courage is one of the many virtues that he discusses in his ethics. You begin with the appropriate feeling. In the case of courage, it is fear, khawf. All normal human beings experience fear. If you are too fearful, you are a coward. That's one extreme, which is undesirable. If you are not fearful when you should be, and you take unnecessary risks, you are rash, sarra, ahmaq. Okay. So these two excesses, one in the direction of one extreme in the direction of excess, one extreme in the direction of deficiency, these are vices. Cowardice is a vice, as well as rashness is a vice. Courage is a mean between these two extremes. Okay. Now he asks a very important practical question. How do you determine exactly where the mean lies? And he says it is not necessarily in the exact mathematical middle. If we have a scale from 0 to 100, the mean need not necessarily be at 50. How to determine the exact location, how close is it to the extreme and to extreme deficiency and excess? He says, I leave that to perception. This is the kind of contextualism he exemplifies, to which I referred earlier. So what we generally know is that courage is a virtue, and it is a mean between these two extremes. To know in any given situation how much risk should I take will depend on the situation. So we do not determine ahead of time the exact location of the mean. Again, this is the contextual nature of his ethics. He's not a relativist, but he thinks that we have first to assess the specific situation we are confronted with, and the advice he gives about avoiding deficiency and excess, advice he gives about making sure to identify the mean would be applied in the context. So there will be situations where it may be desirable to take risks. If saving a human life is involved or some really serious matter worth taking risk for, it would not be wise, nor would it be acting virtuously, if you take risks to achieve ends that are not really significant. All right? So that's roughly his approach. He makes an important distinction. This is number 6. He makes an important distinction between the goods of collaborative activity or joining a profession or a practice. I focus on this point because they are of specific relevance to issues that are currently discussed and important in professional ethics especially. So he asks the question, which those of you who are biology majors perhaps and wishing to go into medicine would at some point ask themselves or be asked, why do I want to become a physician? Why do I want to become an engineer, whatever profession you do? So Aristotle makes a very important, useful distinction. That he distinguishes between the internal good of a practice or profession and the external good. For example, if you want to become a physician because you want to make money, and Aristotle had nothing against people wanting to make money, he was a man of common sense. Okay, Azim, but the making of money is a good you achieve by becoming a physician, but it's an external good. Why external? Because if this is your priority, there are other professions and careers that may enable you to make money more. Become a merchant, he says. Don't go into medicine if money is the basic reason for your wanting to become a physician. You want to be respected and recognized and famous. Azim, that's human, natural. ما في شيء غلط. Okay. But you should not, this should not be the sole reason. Becoming respected and famous and so on is a good that you achieve by becoming a physician, but it's an external good because you may become famous far more easily by becoming a general. He gives this example, politician. Well, I'll use your example. So these are external goods. The question now becomes, what is the internal good of a given practice or profession? What is it that I achieve far better by choosing to become an engineer or a nurse or a physician or a carpenter that is unique to this profession? So I'm focusing on these points because they are one of the reasons why Aristotle's ethics is applied in practice. You can produce out of this very concrete, practical advice to apply in all sorts of situations. And you can ask yourself this question generally, whatever profession you're considering, whatever career, and so on. I want to focus on the section, the contemporary relevance of Aristotle. Now we're in Roman numeral 4. Let me ask you this question. Do we need philosophers? Do we need anybody's advice to agree that, let's say, selling medications that have expired or accepting bribes or a whole set of actions with regard to which we agree that these are wrong? People should not do that. Aristotle felt that it's a waste of time to remind people of things that should be obvious to everybody, unless you're a psychopath. Okay? So what the important question is, it's not agreeing what we ought to do, at least in these clear paradigm cases. It's making sure that people become the sort of persons that will do the right thing. That's the challenge. Now, in a more technical sense, there are two questions. One question is, how do we decide what we ought to do? Modern ethics from the 16th century on focuses on this question. If you are a utilitarian, You say you should try to produce the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people and what have you. This is an important question, and Aristotle does not deny that. And this seems to have become the philosophical question. How do I determine what my obligations are as a moral agent? Why should I take them seriously? Theories of moral obligation provide an account of the nature of obligation, answer the question, what makes those obligations obligatory in the first place? This is a major preoccupation of moral philosophers. And again, Aristotle didn't think this was wrong. But he felt the far more important and challenging question is the question of how to get people to do what they ought to do. This is why in the middle of the last century, around 1950, there was a famous article that a philosopher wrote, which produced a new Aristotelian thinking in ethics. Up till that point, the competing theories were utilitarianism and various versions of Kant's deontological ethics and so on, rule-oriented theories, principle-based theories. They produce the principle of utility or categorical imperative, and I don't have to bore you with this. Then there was a sudden shift back to Aristotle. And this shift consists essentially in focusing on this other question, how to get people to do what they ought to do. The question of determining what we ought to do, again, at least in most important cases, should not be a problem. I have on this page, under the contemporary relevance of Aristotle, I distinguish between these two types of questions that I just did. How do we determine what we ought to do? First question. How to get people to do what they ought to do? The second question. And on the fly sheet, I try to explain, not in simple bullet points. I try to explain, and I will read it because I think it's a very important feature of Aristotle's ethics that accounts and justifies his relevance at any time, any place. What are the types of situations or cases where we need advice and assistance to determine the morally right thing to do? We do not need the services of the moral philosopher to know that it is wrong to sell products such as meat, cheese, or medications, as I indicated earlier, that are harmful and no longer fit for consumption in order to profit or to avoid losing money. We do not try, nor do we need to prove that such acts are wrong. Rather, we want to make sure that these cases are detected and punished. But more importantly, we want to make sure that such acts are prevented. How do we prevent them? Now, there are two courses of action we might take. The immediate necessary action, often, by dealing with these things, by identifying those who did these things, punishing them, and so on, and not simply forgetting about them. نحكي عنهم بالصحف والآخر بعدين ما حدا بيعمل شيء لحدا. Okay. So there are these two ways. One way would be to, when we identify that something wrong has been done, to punish the people who did it, to emphasize the fact that this is wrong and should not be done. Okay. That no one is denying the importance of this immediately practical step. But more importantly, Aristotle would say, we should ask the question, why is it that we have people who will do these things? Why is it that so many of us, too many of us, don't do anything about it? Except complain. وبنحكي حدا بيعمل شيء. Okay. So what are we to do? Okay, I repeat, we should address these cases and deal with violators, but more importantly, we should ask ourselves the searching question, how did things come to be what they are? Why is it that we have these sorts of people, including ourselves? Why is it that we don't do anything about it? And all too often, we find ourselves dragged into doing similar things because everybody's doing it. All right. Now, I'm trying to bring Aristotle home to us and see how this philosopher will deal with these questions. Okay. The relevance of virtue ethics is important in this immediate sense, in the simple fact that our prognosis of what happened should include our failure to instill the proper predispositions to act in the right way in our children. So here they are adults, and they do these sorts of things. Okay. So the long-term solution, the effective solution, would be to make sure that beginning when we should, working on the potential of the child as a social being, to provide the appropriate nourishing environment at home, in the school, in the culture, the role models, and so on, to ensure that this child, through habit, training, example, will grow up to have the appropriate virtues, moral and political virtues. Now, this may seem to be too theoretical, philosophical, ideal. But perhaps realism, in the long run, should be some form of idealism. Is it realistic to address immediate problems, find quick solutions, take shortcuts? You may need to that. You may need to do that, but not at the expense of ignoring the more important and difficult challenge of reconsidering the way the whole community, the whole values that we accept produces this sort of situation. Okay. This, I think, accounts in a very immediate way for the contemporary relevance of Aristotle, or relevance of Aristotle for any human community at any given time or any given place. Now, I want to spend the remaining minutes asking the question, about the contemporary assessment of Aristotle. There are certain things that Aristotle advocated, justified, that we now, I think, justifiably consider to be wrong. So let's look at this side of Aristotle. I chose two examples. His justification of the institution of slavery and his argument that women should be subordinate to men. He was not a feminist. Okay. So these are good examples to illustrate the difference, to use the language of logicians, between a valid argument and a sound argument. How is that? Let's take his justification of the institution of slavery. He makes distinctions, as is typical of Aristotle, between asks the question, is slavery natural or is it conventional? Those who are slaves, are they slaves because of their very nature, or are they slaves because the institution of a given society accepts this practice, and so on? He says it's a combination of both. We need not go into that. His argument to justify the institution of slavery has a simple, clear form. It begins with the premise that the less rational should be subordinated to the more rational. This has to do, the point in the lecture that I did not focus on, and I will do that now. His theory of the soul, which he followed essentially Plato's, his teacher's theory. The human being consists of drives and desires, things that he shares with other species of the genus animal, to use his own terms. What is distinct about the human species, what makes the human species different from other animal species, is rationality. So rationality is the differentia, the unique characteristic possessed by members of the human species, but not by other species of the genus animal. The differentia acquires not only a useful biological classification to distinguish between different types of species within the genus animal, but it acquires value judgments. Rationality is not only what makes human beings different from animals, it is what makes them better. Okay. So this differentia, this characteristic that sets you apart as a human being from other species of animals, is what makes you better. That's a clear value judgment. The analogy, the point could be made best perhaps by looking at an example that Plato, Aristotle's teacher, gave. And his theory of the soul is, Plato's theory of the soul is essentially very, very similar to Aristotle. Plato gives the famous analogy of the chariot. This is a carriage driven by horses. Okay. For this carriage to perform its function properly, we need horses to provide the energy to move the chariot. We also need a driver who would have trained the horses properly, or someone should have trained the horses. So they speed up when you want them to, they slow down, they stop, they go right, they go left. So this analogy is comparable to the human personality. A well-integrated personality will be one where the rational part of the soul, to use the language of Plato and Aristotle, is in control of the non-rational part of the soul. Okay. So the theory of the soul that he advocated is very similar to what now we use different terms in terms of describing. We need to acknowledge that we have drives and feelings and emotions, and also we need to acknowledge that these should be controlled, guided, in order to make sure that the whole organism flourishes and so on. Why is this important? If we extract from this the doctrine that the rational must be subordinated to that the non-rational should be subordinated to the rational, we can produce a whole set of arguments as Aristotle did. So we look at this premise, which he believes he had proven, that the less rational should be subordinated to the more rational. That's the first premise of the argument. Then you add a factual premise, a claim about something or the other. Say you claim that slaves are less rational than their masters. These two premises entail validly a conclusion that slaves should be subordinated to their masters. Even if we accept the first premise, we need not accept the second premise. But if we accept both premises, we are committed to accept the conclusion as true. The same argument he uses, the first premise, the non-rational must be subordinated to the rational. Women are less rational than men. It follows validly that women must be subordinated to men. Of course, in both cases, we should focus on the empirical claim, on the claim that slaves are somehow, by nature, not sufficiently rational, and women, by nature, are not sufficiently rational. If we accept the first premise about the subordination of the less rational to the rational, and we accept the second claim, we are bound, if we are to be consistent, to accept the conclusion. Now, of course, we all know that the second premise in each of these two arguments is questionable, to put it very mildly. So how did a great philosopher, a great mind like Aristotle present these arguments? Are we to say that he's a child of his times, as often is said? That slavery was an established institution and he wanted to justify it. He also believed, by the way, that in order to have great art, great science, to do the sort of things that the Greeks did well at the time, you need to provide leisure time for philosophers and so on. And that's why it's important to have slaves, he felt. Now, of course, we make these points not to accept the conclusion, but perhaps to understand what led Aristotle to arrive at these conclusions. In both cases, fortunately, in the case of proving the fact that slaves should be subordinated to their masters or women should be subordinated to men, we no longer agree with that, although we may still accept the first premise about the superiority of rationality over the lack of rationality. So the point I want to make here is that we should not be over-impressed with a philosopher. And indeed, there is a lot in Aristotle to impress us. And he is part of the contemporary scene in all sorts of areas. I mentioned professional ethics and so on. To arrive at the conclusion that therefore we must agree with almost everything he says. Thank you very much.